Hi, welcome back to McClutchy Maths. My name is Natalie McClutchy and today we are talking about inflation, which is a hot topic, and it's part of our consumer arithmetic series aimed at students in grades 10, 11 and 12. In this particular video, we are going to talk about what inflation is, and then I'm going to take you through some worked examples for maths students to use inflation to work out worded problems. Inflation is a hot topic in the media. You know it has something to do with money and the price of everyday items increasing, but what causes it and how is it measured? I'm sure you've all heard a parent or a grandparent talk about the price of bread and milk back in their day. For example, a loaf of bread cost 4 cents in the year 1900, but costs about $1.69 now. Does that mean that everybody was rich in the year 1900 because everything was so cheap? No, it doesn't, because wages were also lower relative to the cost of living. For example, a nurse in the year 1900 was paid $720 per year, but now earns on average about $80,000 a year. Let's start with the better definition of what inflation is. Inflation is defined as an increase in prices across a range of spending categories, which reduces the purchasing value of money. Each country measures inflation using a Consumer Price Index, or a CPI. Each month, the government takes a sample of around 700 to 1,000 goods and services, and then compares this basket month by month to see how prices are changing. When the cost of the basket increases, the CPI, which is recorded as a percentage, will also increase. The government publishes these figures every month and uses them to make important decisions, such as whether to encourage consumer spending to grow the economy. As can be seen in the graph, Australia has enjoyed quite low inflation over the past 20 years compared to the 1980s. We have hit a peak in 2022, which is the highest in almost 15 years, hence the media hype. Interestingly, experts seem to be predicting inflation to plateau over the next few years at about 2.5%. Inflation is a complex economic force and can be caused by a number of factors, including poor government management of debt, worker shortages, rising wages, and disruptions in the supply chain. We have seen the war in the Ukraine recently spark fears of food and fuel shortages, which has impacted us with higher prices at the petrol pump. The cost of increased fuel has a flow-on effect through the economy, raising the cost of everyday products through higher transportation and delivery costs. Now, because this is a math channel, we don't need to go into a great deal of detail and explain how inflation in the economy works. That's a topic for business students. We just need to be able to calculate how it will affect our everyday consumer purchases. Let's jump into worked example 1. The table below shows us quarterly CPI, Consumer Price Index figures, for 2 consecutive years. That means 2 years in a row. CPI figures are given as a percentage change from the previous year. Calculate the annual CPI for 2008 and 2009. What this question is actually asking you to do is to calculate an average of the CPI for the whole year, because the annual CPI is basically all of the CPIs through the year taken as an average. Now, we know from statistics, when we're taking an average, we add up the values and divide by how many values there are. So for 2008, we're going to add those 4 different percentages from this row in the table together and divide by 4, and we need to give our answer with the percentage. It's 4.4%. Always have a little bit of a logic check, because an average should be inside the data values. And yes, it is. It's less than the greatest number, and it's more than the smallest number. So it's within the data values, because the mean or the average is a measure of centre. So it should be in the middle of the data somewhere. 2009, we're going to add those 4 values from the second row here, dividing by 4 again. We're going to get 1.9%. Do another quick logic check. Is 1.9 inside the data set? Yes, it is. So there's our average CPI for the 2 years. Part B. A weekly grocery shop costs $225 at the beginning of 2008. Calculate the cost of the grocery shop at the end of the year. So we're starting the year, we're spending $225 on groceries, and then there's inflation on those groceries, and the annual rate we calculated was 4.4%. So what we're going to do is increase that basket by 4.4%. Now, you recall from watching our previous videos on increasing by a percentage that what we need to do is we're going to be raising that cost by 4.4%. So we've got to find 4.4% of $225 and then add it to the $225. So firstly, we need to change that 4.4% from a percentage to a decimal by dividing by 100. And that gives us 0.044. Then our next step is we're going to add 100% to the inflation rate and then multiply it by the grocery shop. So I'm going to add 1, which is 100%, to the 4.4%, and then I'm going to times that by the grocery shop of $225, and that's going to give me an answer of $234.90. So my groceries are going to cost me about an extra $10 by the end of 1 year. It's a bit rough, isn't it? That's the power of inflation though. Now you might be wondering, why did I add the 1? If you're not sure what I was doing there when I multiplied that by 1.044, you're going to need to go back and watch some of our videos on increasing by a percentage. That's assumed prior knowledge here that you know how to do that. If I just multiplied this by 0.044, I'd be finding the amount of the increase, which was about the $10 mark. I don't want to do that. I actually want to do the increase itself, not just find how much it increased by. So that's why we multiply by 1.044. Okay, a house costs $350,000 at the beginning of 2009. Calculate the cost of the house in 10 years' time, assuming no change in inflation. Okay, so let's do that. Now, something to be aware of is that inflation has a compounding effect. And what that means is we're going to use the compound interest formula to calculate the future value of the house. So what we could do is we could take the value of 350,000 times it by 1.9%, come up with an answer, times that by 1.9%, come up with an answer, times that by 1.9%, and do that 10 times. Super tedious. Why would you do that? Because when you're multiplying it by 1.09, 1.09, 1.09, you're raising it to the power of 10. So we're going to use, first of all, change that rate to a percentage, 0.019. We're going to use that compound interest formula. And if you don't know much about compound interest, we've got a video in this series on it. Go watch it. Okay, so state your variables. The principal is the amount of the house at the beginning, 350,000. Interest is 0.019, and the number of years is 10, number of compounding periods. It's compounded 10 times. Now, something to be aware of with inflation, we only compound annually. We don't compound every quarter or every month or every week. It's just use that average annual rate and compound it once per year. Okay, so now we're going to substitute into the formula and solve it. So we need to write a statement. The house will be valued at approximately $422,484. The reason why I've rounded off to whole dollars is because it's such a big amount. You wouldn't be valuing your house with dollars and cents. You'd be valuing it in whole numbers. In fact, chances are they even round it up to the nearest thousand. So I'll round it down to the nearest thousand. But it's going to be worth about $422,000 in 10 years' time. Super exciting if you own the house. All right, Olivia purchased a rare painting for $2,500 in 2015 and sold it in 2022 for $3,400. Now, you're probably thinking, well, it says here, calculate her profit, factoring in an inflation rate of 2.3% on average. You might be thinking, woohoo, Olivia has made $900 on that painting. 3,400 take away 2,500. But the answer is no, because she's held it for 7 years. That painting has its original value of 2,500 has had inflation applied to it for 7 straight years. What that means is that her buying power is less than what it was 7 years ago. So we need to, first of all, work out what that $2,500 is in today's money terms. So we're going to calculate the present value today of that painting by adding inflation. So once again, we're going to write the formula and state our variables. We're going to substitute into the formula, and then we're going to work out that the value of the painting today is $29,300 in today's dollars, okay? Because today's dollars are not the same as 7 years ago's dollars. Okay, now we're going to calculate the profit using that inflated cost price. We're going to subtract the cost price from the sell price. So we're going to do 3,400, take away this inflated value, and then her profit is not going to be what we thought it was going to be, $900. It's going to be $464, which is a little bit disappointing for Olivia. She hasn't made anywhere near as much as she thought she was going to make. About half of what she thought she was going to make. Power of inflation chewed up the value of her money. Okay, let's talk a little bit about inflation and budgeting. So some things to be aware of. When you're planning future purchases, you might be planning a holiday in 4 years' time, or to buy a car or a house in 3 or 4 years' time, then when you're budgeting for that, you need to take into account that inflation is going to change your expected future costs. So let's say I wanted to go to America in 3 years' time, and I did all my calculations using the internet and I found out all of the costs today. Well, those costs are going to go up. And so I need to apply inflation to those and work out what they're going to be, what's going to cost me in 3 years' time. Now, when we create a budget, and if you don't know about budgeting, you should watch that video too. When we create a budget, it's a schedule of our future planned income less our expenses. Now, if you don't invest that money in the bank, then you need to factor the inflation in. And you need to bear in mind that your expenses often increase far quicker than your wages or your salary does. So typically what happens in real life is the electricity company will put their bill up every year. The council will put their rates up every single year, sometimes with inflation, sometimes higher than inflation. However, sometimes salary and income and wages are locked in at a rate for a couple of years as part of an enterprise bargaining arrangement with a union or with your employer. You're locked in at that rate until something changes. For example, they decide to renegotiate your wages. So even though your expenses are going up and up and up, sometimes your income's not. So that's something to be aware of when you're creating a budget at home. For next year, you need to make sure you take this year's expenses and increase them by inflation, or increase them by maybe even more than inflation, so that you know what your future expenses are going to be. Now, let's say you're creating a scenario of you want to save up $50,000 to go on a holiday. It's a big holiday. And you want to budget for that for 3 years. So you might be wondering, do I apply inflation to my budget for 3 straight years? Yes, you could on your expenses and your income, but if you're actually investing the savings, so let's say you make $1,000 and you save from that $300. That $300 is going to go into the bank potentially, and it's going to earn interest over that time. So you wouldn't need to inflate the salary as well as the expenses. You're only inflating your savings. And the way that inflation applies for that is the power of compound interest in your bank account. So in this situation, you wouldn't actually need to apply inflation at all because it's going straight into the bank. And the bank's doing the inflation for you. However, you do need to inflate your holiday costs for the future because they're definitely not going to be what you budgeted for now. Some observations and assumptions you can make about inflation for your PSMT, something to bear in mind, is that we've observed today that inflation rarely remains the same from quarter to quarter. In fact, we can see that year on year, we saw in the video that inflation changes every year. So to make assumptions that the inflation rate is going to stay the same is not really very realistic. So in order to plan for the future though, we need to have some sort of idea about what inflation is going to do. So we typically use past inflation to predict future inflation. In our last example, for example, when we had that person saving for their holiday, we had to make an assumption that inflation was not going to change. Otherwise, how on earth would you calculate a future amount? So that's why we make assumptions about what's going to happen. We assume it's going to stay the same. And that's not realistic. It's not reasonable. And that makes a real risk or a limitation to our budget because it's never going to be the real deal. So when we make an assumption that inflation is not going to stay the same, we know that's not going to happen. So our future budget will probably buy us less than what we're expecting. That's a risk or a limitation. Hopefully that was helpful to you. That was a bit of a cheeky few hints there for your PSMTs. And if it was, why don't you tell someone about this video? Share it with them on social media. Tell us that you found it helpful in the comments and share the link with somebody. And if you've got any questions about something you saw or heard in today's video, you can contact me at mcclutchymass@yahoo.com. And also reach us on Facebook or Instagram. Now, please, please, please bear in mind that this was a maths video. It wasn't meant to be a finance business video. So if you're a business, economics, or a finance student at university and you've watched this video and think, I've got so much more to offer about inflation than she shared, yes, you do. I tried to keep it simple for our maths students today. So please bear in mind that was the context of the video. It wasn't meant to be an economics lecture. It was meant to help math students. So if you've got any questions about maths, contact me at mcclutchymaths@yahoo.com. Also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You never know, you might see something fun there. And I'd like to welcome a lot of our new subscribers over the last month. We've got way more than that. This is just the ones I could fit on the slide. Thank you so much for joining us here. We really appreciate your ongoing visits to the channel and love the emails and the comments that you give us. It's a great deal of excellent feedback. Thank you so much. Well, you've been watching McClutchy Maths on inflation. I'm Natalie McClutchy. Have a wonderful day.